Hello, welcome to SEN Unplugged. I'm Mark Small, Solicitor Advocate, and in this week's edition we're going to look at education, health and care needs assessment. Now, the first thing to look at is what is an education, health and care needs assessment, and why might I need one? An education, health and care needs assessment is exactly what it says. It's an assessment of a child or young person's education, health and care needs. It's an assessment that's done by the local authority, and in conducting the assessment, the local authority follows a statutory process which involves outside agencies, including schools, colleges if appropriate, experts like an educational psychologist, specialist teachers, and colleagues from the health service and social care. And it's done in accordance with what's called the Children and Families Act and accompanying regulations called the Special Educational Needs and Disability Regulations 2014. And in carrying out the assessment, the local authority will of course liaise with parents and carers and will seek the views as appropriate of the child or the young person. Why might I need an education, health and care needs assessment? The first thing to be aware of is that whenever a child attends an educational setting, the educational setting has duties to identify, assess and make provision for children that have special educational needs. All educational settings have some degree of delegated funding, and in the first instance there is a duty on those settings to use their best endeavours to provide support for children and young people that have special educational needs. The type of support you can expect will be set out in the educational settings provision, which is available on their website. It's also available on the local offer, which describes the criteria that the local authority will apply before deciding whether an education, health and care needs assessment is necessary. The first thing to think about is whether the child actually needs to be put forward for an EH needs assessment. So the questions that you should have as a parent are, firstly, is there a clear understanding of your child's difficulties in their educational setting? So as part of something called Assess, Plan, Do, Review, which is set out in the SEN Code of Practice, all educational settings are required to have involved professionals before children and young people are put forward for assessment, or at least that's the guidance that the code gives. So the EHC needs assessment should not be the first time your child sees, for example, an educational psychologist or a speech and language therapist or even an occupational therapist. It should be a build-up of support over time with provision being put in place to see whether the child is making progress through the resources that are available to the educational setting. And that's a very important thing to think about, because what the EHC assessment will do is identify what additional resources might be required, and if necessary, to secure those additional resources by issuing something called the Education, Health and Care Plan. And that's something that we're going to look at in a different video vlog. So in terms of the school, the important things to consider are the support that's been in place, the progress, the level of resources that have been utilised, and importantly, what external services have been brought in by the educational setting. Have they brought in a psychologist? Have they brought in speech and language therapists or occupational therapists, or made the relevant referrals? And as a parent, you should be ensuring that the schools are taking proactive steps to involve external agencies, particularly where you have concerns about your child's progress and learning difficulties. So what's the criteria then for obtaining an education, health and care needs assessment? Well, the first thing to say is that you can make a request as a parent to the local authority for an EH needs assessment. The request is made in writing. Some local authorities use a prescribed form, some don't. The important thing is, and you can forget a lot of the advice out there, the important thing is that when you make your written request, that you set out in detail the nature of your child's difficulties as you see them as a parent, the support that's been in place for them, the progress that you say is not being made, and crucially, what additional provision do you think they need? Because that's going to inform some of the questions that the local authority is going to have to ask itself. Now, when the local authority considers applications for EH needs assessment, they have to apply the law. And look, we're not going to talk about legal principles here. That's for someone else. What we're going to do is put it in layman's terms. So, Section 36 of the Children and Families Act is what you need to look at. But basically, when broken down, that requires the local authority to consider whether the child or young person has or may have special educational needs. So that's the first thing to focus on. Now, a special educational need is either a learning difficulty. So when we think about learning difficulties, that could be difficulties with their cognition, perhaps literacy, numeracy difficulties. Dyslexia is often identified as a learning difficulty, a speech, language or communication difficulty, a sensory or physical difficulty, or social and emotional difficulties. All of those things can have an impact on a child's learning, and if they are significant, then they are going to be regarded as a special educational need. The child or young person may also have a disability, and it's important not to lose sight of that. So they might not have any obvious learning difficulty or language difficulty, but they may have a physical disability which impacts on their ability to access mainstream education. Or they could have a difficulty like epilepsy, which is a disability, and without support that would impact on their ability to access mainstream. So those are examples of a special educational need. The second aspect of the test is a need to show that the child requires special educational provision, and that's generally regarded as resources that are additional to those that are ordinarily available within a mainstream school. So what essentially the local authority has to ask itself is, on a balance of probabilities, is it likely that the child's going to need more support than the educational setting can provide? And that's an important thing to think about. What the local authority then has to consider is whether the special educational needs provision needs to be provided by way of an EHC plan. So those are the elements that the local authority has to consider. Now, the important thing for parents is this is not a high threshold. You only have to show that the child may have special educational needs and may require additional support through an EHC plan. And in those circumstances, the local authority has the duty to assess. If you want further information about that, then you can look at 931 and 919 of the SEN Code of Practice, January 2015. Now, that can be downloaded from the Department for Education website, or you can simply enter it into a Google search. And if you look at those sections of the code, they describe all the factors that the local authority would have to consider. It's also certainly worth your time, thinking about what criteria the local authority applies. Now, although it's not strictly relevant because the statutory test will prevail, local authorities do develop their own criteria. So it's important to be aware of them. So if necessary, you can challenge them when you make your application. So your child doesn't need to be 2 or 3 years behind. Your child doesn't have to have difficulties in each of the areas, education, health and social care. They simply have to have a learning difficulty that calls for special educational needs provision to be made via an EHC plan. But it's worth looking at that local authority criteria, because one of the things that local authorities frequently do is introduce something called top-up funding. So all schools, educational settings, as I've said, have delegated money. Local authorities also provide a mechanism where they can access top-up funding without having to ask for an EHC plan or the child then needing an education, health and care plan. So it's very important that if top-up funding is being deployed in your local authority, that you know your school has accessed it or attempted to access it and has made any applications promptly. And you can find out more about top-up funding through the local offer. And if you've got any concerns, then it's something that you should raise directly with the school. But what you must never do is be fobbed off by the school or by the local authority if they were to say to you, we're not going to make an application because we haven't made an application for high needs funding. The two things are very, very different. You can ask for an education, health and care needs assessment at any time. There's no restriction on the number of requests that you can make. The only restriction is you can't ask for an assessment if your child's been assessed within the last 6 months through the formal statutory procedures. So what's the actual process for making the request? Well, as I said earlier on, you make your request for EH needs assessment by making a written request to the local authority. And it's important to provide as much information in detail to the local authority when you make that request, and to send to them any reports that you've got. The reason being is that the local authority only has 6 weeks to decide if it's going to carry out that assessment. So it's better to give it all the information up front so that it can make an informed decision. Quite a lot of time can be wasted because inadequate or incomplete information is sent to the local authority. And in those circumstances, they're likely to say no to a request. When the request is received by the local authority, they should send you a letter acknowledging that you've made a formal EHC needs assessment request, and they will write you to tell you what's going to happen next. And in practice, what really happens is the local authority starts to seek out information from all of the professionals that have been involved with your child, and they seek to identify whether there's a case for an assessment to be carried out. If an assessment is agreed, then that must be made within 6 weeks of the request being received by the local authority. And we're going to talk about what you can expect from the assessment in a minute. But ultimately, it's important that when your views are being sought, that you respond to the local authority in a timely fashion so as not to delay the decision-making process, and if necessary, put pressure on your school. In my opinion, some of the key things that you need to do when you've made your request for assessment and it's being considered by the local authority are setting out for them the special educational needs provision that you think is required, identifying why you think the school are not able to meet need through their existing resources, and making sure you've got minutes of any meetings or emails with the school where they've perhaps raised resources as an issue, because all that will strengthen your case. The local authority will generally take all of the evidence to an SEN panel, and it will decide whether to make an assessment at that panel meeting. Now, SEN panels don't have formal decision-making powers, but the chair of the panel is generally the SEN officer or an SEN manager, and they have the authority to make the decision. And they use the SEN panel as a form of moderation to make sure that there's consistency in their decision-making. And they will ask the panel for their views on the papers that they've read. It's not a process that parents get invited to, but you don't need to, because in reality, they're really just looking at those issues. Is there a special need? What's the support that's required? Can it be provided by the school? Is an EHC plan required to do that? And that really is it. Once they've made their decision, ultimately there's two options open. They can either proceed to an assessment, or they can say no. What happens if they say no? If they say no, you have the right to challenge that decision to the first tier tribunal, Special Educational Needs and Disability. You have 2 months from the date of the letter the local authority sends you, refusing the request, to lodge an appeal. The only thing that you have to do before registering the appeal is to have considered the option of mediation. And that requires you to phone a mediation advisor and speak to them about whether the dispute can be resolved through the use of mediation services. The details of the mediation advisor will be set out in the letter refusing your application for an EHC needs assessment. So it's important that you contact them as soon as possible. You then have a further 30 calendar days to register any appeal to the first tier tribunal. Now, don't overlook mediation, because mediation is very important. Mediation is free for you to access. It's independent of the local authority, and it can lead to an independent person pulling together all of the information in a formal mediation session with a view to bringing the parties close together in deciding whether there should be an assessment. So it's not something that you should overlook, particularly as appeals to the SEN tribunal could take anything up to 20 weeks. Now, with appeals involving refusals to assess, the application to the tribunal is started using Form 35A, and that's a form that you can download from the Special Educational Needs and Disability Tribunal website. and we'll put the link up on the website for you and in the video so that you can make that application should you wish. Appeals are generally dealt with on the papers, although you can ask for an oral hearing in some circumstances. Probably the most likely that I've encountered is if you've got a learning difficulty yourself and won't be able to present your case in a written form. In those circumstances, the tribunal are likely to convene an oral hearing. And we'll talk generally about tribunals in another vlog. But safe to say, it's important that if you are unhappy with the decision of the local authority, that you challenge them and certainly make use of mediation before going to the SEN tribunal. So what can you expect when the local authority says yes to an assessment? When the local authority agrees to carry out an assessment, they will write to you and they'll explain that they're carrying out a formal EH needs assessment. As part of that process, they will seek your views and they'll send you a prescribed form for you to be able to detail your thoughts. And when you get that form, it's important to set out your views as to your child's progress, what support you feel they require, and what your own aspirations are for them, and perhaps even what you expect to gain from having an education, health and care plan. Your child may also be asked to give views, and that may be done through the educational psychologist that the local authority is required to seek advice from. So what happens when the EH needs assessment is underway is that the local authority will seek advice and information from parents and carers. They may seek advice from the school. They may seek advice from the educational psychologist and any specialist teachers that are involved, and they will liaise with the health and social care services to pull any information that those agencies have got about your child. So if you have got professionals involved in different agencies, then it's really important to draw the local authority's attention to that when you first make the request for assessment, because it makes the process a lot smoother. What the local authority will then do is, if it needs to arrange new assessments, it will do that, and it will compile that information. Now, I'm often asked, we're going to commission our own private experts, will the local authority take that into account? And the answer to that is, they're required to take it into account, but it won't be determinative in deciding whether they're going to ultimately issue an education, health and care plan. And that is the next stage of the local authority's decision-making process. So what happens is that over a period of about 6 weeks, so by now we're into week 12, the local authority at the end of that 12th week will most likely then decide, does the child need an education, health and care plan? And the question for it to basically ask itself, given the evidence that's been compiled through the assessment, is it necessary to secure the child's additional support through an education, health and care plan? Or does the setting have those resources already within their budget, and all the assessment has done is to identify how those resources need to be utilised? And that is what the local authority will focus on at this point. So roughly 12 to 14 weeks into the timetable, what you can expect is a meeting to be called with the local authority, with your school, and possibly even with professionals. And at that meeting, the local authority will discuss with you whether they're going to issue an education, health and care plan. We're going to do a separate video on what an education, health and care plan looks like and how you need to go about it once they issue it. But essentially, if they say they are going to issue an education, health and care plan, they would then be required to provide a draft copy of that plan to you and enter into discussions with you about the content. If they decide they're not going to issue an education, health and care plan, then that will trigger another right of appeal for you to the Special Educational Needs Tribunal, and the option of utilising mediation as well. There's lots of information for you to digest. If you want further information, then you can access it from the SEN4U website, or you can ask further queries of us on our Facebook page @SendAdvice. You can also access local services such as the SendIAS service, which is independent of the local authority, and they can provide advice to you as well about the assessment process. If you need further legal advice, then by all means give us a call, and if necessary, we can always provide support for you. And lastly, if you've enjoyed this video, send, subscribe, like, share. We're always looking for feedback for future videos, so we hope you found this useful. I'm Mark Small. Let's make SEN great again.